Hello, class, and welcome back to the Wandering Cantos. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a literary study of Rent-a-Girlfriend. So, a bit about today's video. Today, we're going to take a look at the first volume of Rent-a-Girlfriend. The purpose of this video is to essentially treat this manga the same way you would treat any of the literary classics in a high school or college English class. So basically, this means that we will take a look at the plot of each chapter, do a little character analysis, and then discuss things like theme. So, spoiler warning for Volume 1 of Rent-a-Girlfriend. Everything after this will be in spoiler territory. That being said, I'm only going to be focused on content within Volume 1. And also, don't forget to subscribe so you're notified when the rest of the series is posted. I'm planning on doing an episode per volume. And we are also taking a look at the Quintessential Quintuplets. The first video for that just was released this week, so if you're interested in that series instead, just wanted to let you know. So, we start with Chapter 1, My Girlfriend, Chizuru Mizuhara. So, Chapter 1 begins with an introduction of Kazuya, the main protagonist of the series. Kazuya has just gone through an unexpected breakup and he's taking it really poorly. As a result, he decides to hire a rental girlfriend. As a side note, this is actually a real service in Japan, and it's not just limited to girlfriends or the role of a girlfriend. I highly recommend watching the film Rental Family. It was one of my favorite films from last year, and it's also based on this industry, and Brendan Fraser is in it. It's really, really good, and it seems like it's like just a normal sort of like heartwarming film, but there's actually a lot more going on with it, and I just can't recommend it enough. But anyway, his rental girlfriend ends up being the stylish and sophisticated woman named Chizuru Mizuhara. She's also in college, and the two seem to get along well. Afterwards, however, Kazuya grows resentful of the fake nature of the relationship and thinks that the industry in general is manipulative. So, determined to tell Chizuru off for basically manipulating him, Kazuya rents her services again. After causing a scene, however, Kazuya is surprised when Chizuru starts calling him out for his hypocrisy and in general how ridiculous he is being. Kazuya realizes just how different the real Chizuru is from her girlfriend persona. However, before this can sort of continue, Kazuya gets a call telling him that his grandmother has been rushed to the hospital. Since they are still on their date, Chizuru comes with Kazuya to the hospital. There, Kazuya introduces Chizuru to his whole family as his girlfriend, which is sort of a major yikes. He later explains to Chizuru that his grandmother is sort of like the true matriarch of his family and that her health has been declining. She has this big dream for Kazuya to get a decent girlfriend, so he wanted her to believe that that dream had come true before she passed on. Afterwards, Kazuya and Chizuru go their separate ways, but end up basically being on relatively good terms. That is, however, until they later realize that they go to the same college. And that brings us to Chapter 2, My Girlfriend. So, basically, because of their embarrassing connection and Chizuru's secret job, Kazuya and Chizuru have to awkwardly navigate acting like they don't know each other while bumping into each other, on the college campus. However, when Kazuya's grandmother asks him to bring his girlfriend to the hospital to meet her friends, Kazuya is unable to tell his grandmother the truth. Instead, he begs Chizuru to let him rent her one more time. She initially turns him down since it's against company policy, but Kazuya blackmails her with the threat of telling everyone on campus her secret. So she agrees, but says that this will be the last time. So, things seem to go well at first. Kazuya's grandmother is smitten with Chizuru. However, things go south fast when Kazuya's grandmother tries to bring in other patients from the hospital. This is because Chizuru's grandmother is also a patient in this hospital and she does not know about Chizuru's side gig. At first, they try to hide in another hospital room, but they're eventually caught. To save face, Chizuru tells her grandmother that Kazuya is her boyfriend, thus digging them both deeper into the lie. Once they've left the hospital, however, they strategize a plan to tell their grandmothers that they've broken up. Kazuya seems to have found closure from this and even deletes the rental service app. He steps outside his apartment as a newly determined man, only to find out that Chizuru is literally his next door neighbor. And that brings us to Chapter 3, The Girl Next Door. So, Chapter 3 starts with the initial confrontation between Kazuya and Chizuru as they both discover their living situation. However, things quickly get worse when Kazuya's grandmother announces that she's stopping by and wants Kazuya to invite Chizuru over, because again, she doesn't know they live next door to each other. Kazuya fears that telling his grandmother the truth will basically make her go into shock, so he begs Chizuru to be his girlfriend one more time. Chizuru scolds Kazuya for being so spineless and refuses to keep up the charade. As a result, Kazuya is forced to host his grandmother all alone, while also keeping up the lie. He starts to break under the pressure, however, and asks Chizuru for help one more time, which she refuses again. So, since Chizuru isn't showing up, Kazuya's grandmother begins to suspect that the two broke up. However, right as she begins to confront Kazuya about this, Chizuru impulsively stops by and keeps up the charade. It turns out that Kazuya's grandmother actually snuck out of the hospital for this visit, so she's ushered away shortly afterwards, so things don't get too awkward. Afterwards, Chizuru relents and agrees to keep up the charade long term, allowing Kazuya to rent her services for 1 hour every Wednesday. However, one further complication arises right as the chapter ends. Kazuya's father sees Kazuya handing money to Chizuru. And that brings us to Chapter 4, My Ex, Mami Nanami. So, Chapter 4 starts with Kazuya back on campus. He bumps into his ex, Mami, and wants to ask why she blocked him on Twitter, but can't muster the courage to do so. Despite this whole rental girlfriend situation, Kazuya is clearly still not over Mami. Later that day, he has a planned date with Chizuru to meet with his grandmother. However, along the way, he bumps into his two friends, Kibe and Kuri. They can't believe he has such a well put together girlfriend, and Kazuya gets carried away gloating about it. Afterwards, Kibe invites Kazuya and Chizuru to a drinking party. Kazuya, still in bragging mode, agrees even though this is only going to further complicate things. And also, Chizuru is not happy about this. Regardless, they go to the drinking party only to find Kazuya's ex, Mami, there. And this brings us to Chapter 5, My Girlfriend and My Ex. So, the drinking party is, as you can expect, extremely awkward. Mami makes several passive to aggressive level jabs at Kazuya, and also acts overly familiar with him in order to sort of like throw shade at Chizuru. Mami is clearly jealous of Chizuru. Chizuru, notably, however, stands up for Kazuya and defends him against these insults. In a moment of total weakness, Kazuya doesn't take Chizuru's side and somewhat defends Mami. He basically tells her that it's alright and it's always been like this, but this is embarrassing considering that Chizuru just called out this behavior. In response, Chizuru storms out and leaves the party. Kibe scolds Kazuya for not taking care of Chizuru, and Kazuya walks home alone and very drunk. Along the way, however, he bumps into Mami. Mami helps him walk and asks if he wants to rest at her place for a bit. And that closes Volume 1. So, that brings us to our general discussion. So, my first impressions. This is not as bad as I was expecting. So, I don't actually know much about the plot of this manga, but whenever I hear it come up, it's usually in a really negative light, though I don't actually know why it's considered, negative. So far, however, I feel like it's a pretty standard story. Maybe it gets worse later on, but nothing about this really stands out as being that different from a classic sort of slice of life romance comedy. The college setting. One of my favorite parts about this series so far is that it takes place in college. A lot of these slice of life romance comedies take place in high school, so it's fun getting to see a totally different social dynamic. The more laid back atmosphere of college campuses, the lack of uniforms, apartment living, and also with apartment living being independent, and drinking parties are all fun and fresh feeling. And I feel like this plot so far is a bit Shakespearean. In my last point, I called this a slice of life romance comedy, and I really want to emphasize that so far, I feel like this feels more like a comedy than a standard romance. The setup reminds me a bit of some of Shakespeare's plays, like Much Ado About Nothing, where two bickering people who kind of hate each other have to pretend to be lovers. Sort of where the whole, enemies to lovers trope almost starts. So, other first impressions, I low-key don't like Kazuya already, and I'm not sure if he's the kind of protagonist you're supposed to truly like, though. I feel like he's more supposed to be a ridiculous character who does dumb stuff to stir up drama and basically for comedic effect. That being said, I really hate his grandmother. I have no idea if this is an unpopular opinion or not. Originally, I thought maybe it was just a cultural thing, but Chizuru's grandmother isn't like Kazuya's, and also Chizuru seems to have a much more normal relationship with her grandmother. She doesn't really shy away from telling her grandmother the truth or whatnot. And so I just find her general pushiness to be really annoying, and she also seems to have no sense of boundaries and is constantly saying really uncomfortable stuff. So I feel like my annoyance with Kazuya is directly related to his association with his grandma. And as a general note, I'm very curious to see how Kazuya and Chizuru are going to be able to keep up with all of these lies. We are only one volume in, and things seem very complex already. And also, to go back to my previous point, I feel like what I want to highlight with the whole association thing is that I don't know how annoying Kazuya would be if his grandmother and family weren't in the plot, and this was just about a guy who rents a rental girlfriend and then sort of accidentally falls in love with her. I feel like why it's so annoying is he's making her keep up with the lies for his family's sake, if that makes sense. So, some themes and main ideas. So the first one is lying may give quick relief, but it soon causes further complications. I get the impression that this entire series is ultimately going to be about lying. Here in this volume, there have already been so many lies that even related lies end up having totally different contexts and implications. So Kazuya lies about having a girlfriend, Chizuru lies about her job, Chizuru lies about having a boyfriend, Chizuru is lying to her company about her dates with Kazuya. They've both lied to Kazuya's friends and his ex. Kazuya's grandmother lied about being released from the hospital, and Mommy even seems to be lying about her relationship with Kazuya and just how serious their relationship was. Characters also seem to be lying to themselves. Kazuya seems to be already developing feelings for Chizuru, but tells himself that he's only interested in Mommy. Mommy also lies to her friends and basically, I would, say to herself about being over Kazuya. So ultimately, all of these lies are likely to eventually catch up to these characters. There's also the idea that continuing the lies to avoid short-term consequence. So it's kind of interesting how Kazuya already almost had to finally come clean to his grandmother. He's terrified of telling her the truth, but he's also just in general terrified to also tell her the lie that he and Chizuru broke up, even though that would be easier than telling her the truth. However, when his grandmother guesses that they broke up and the door is finally wide open to broach the subject, he still falters. And furthermore, even though she was sort of lecturing him, his grandmother was taking the news a lot better than he claimed she would. It's not like she had the heart attack and died. He always, says to Chizuru, "We can't tell my grandmother. She'll probably like die as a result." But she actually seemed to be handling it fine. Obviously, she's annoyed, but she didn't die. So it's sort of strange in a way that Chizuru decided to interrupt this conversation and keep the lie going, because the longer this goes on, the worse it's going to be when the truth finally comes out. And the other one I want to discuss is basically pride and jealousy. It's worth noting that the key motivations behind all of this lying seems to be pride and jealousy. Characters are either lying to defend their pride or because they're jealous, and ironically, because of that jealousy, they lie to protect their pride. And I think a good example of this is Kazuya's lie to his family. He claims outwardly that he doesn't want to tell his grandmother the truth because it would crush her. But in reality, I think it's more because he doesn't want to admit that he still can't get a girlfriend. He seems to enjoy showing Chizuru off to his friends and family, so I sort of call BS on his claim that he's only keeping up the lie for his grandmother's sake. Ultimately, however, pride often leads to one's downfall, so we're going to have to, stay tuned and see how things work out. So my final thoughts, so far I'm enjoying this series enough. I'm also working on a series on the Quintessential Quintuplets, and I will say that that series drew me in more quickly. I think it helps that it has more characters and more likable characters. Again, I'm not sure how much we're supposed to really like characters like Kazuya and how much of it is more watching them struggle for our own comedic entertainment. It's sort of how with soap operas or reality TV, it's not like they have to necessarily be the most likable characters, they just have to be entertaining. So in that way, it's just a totally different type of story from the Quintessential Quintuplets, where I do think we're supposed to like Futaro and truly be cheering him on. I do hope that things eventually move on from them just going on dates, almost getting caught, and then lying to get out of it, but we'll just have to wait and see what happens. So with that, I'm going to pretty much wrap up today's video. So if you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing and giving the video a like. It helps grow the community, and why that matters is it helps to grow sort of the discourse and the conversation in the comments below, where I kind of want this to almost feel like a book club. So what are your thoughts on this volume? And please don't spoil anything from future volumes in the comments, since we are going to be going volume by volume. So, do you think I'm being a little too harsh on Kazuya's grandma? Is it crazy to call this manga series Shakespearean? And have you ever gotten wrapped up in a crazy lie like this? I think this might be one of the most insane series of lies, all put together. So I'm not sure if I can relate to this at all, but I'm wondering if any of you have any crazy stories like that. But with that being said, I'm going to wrap this one up. So take care, and I will see you in the next one.